Welcome everyone who is joining the next Sustainable Herbs Program Toolkit webinar. As you enter, it would be great if you could introduce yourself in the chat, let us know where you're joining from and your interest, experience, role in the botanical industry or with carbon labeling. I will go ahead and share my screen for a sec. So I'm thrilled to be here today with Jane Frank and Kayalin Akens-Irby, and we'll be talking about the carbon footprint of tea and really what companies can do to measure and their carbon footprint and address what they find. And we have one more webinar for this season, and that will be on the rescheduled webinar with Thomas Avery Guerin on June 30th, and that's at 6 p.m. Eastern. In order to, Thomas lives in Beijing, and he'll be talking sort of a perspective on his experience of visiting farms in China, growing botanicals, and sort of a firsthand view of that side of the industry. And then we'll be taking a break from the webinars for the summer. And if you've been joining these webinars and there's something you're interested in, we send a survey out when we send the follow-up video, copy of the recording, and we'd love to have your feedback. Let us know what you'd like to see in the future, if you want us to continue, the particular people or subjects, please share that on the survey. And also let us know which ones in particular you've liked more than others. As always, all of these webinars are made available for free through the generous support of our underwriters. You can find out those companies on this slide and learn more about all of them on our website. Also made available through the membership of the American Botanical Council. And you can find out more about becoming a member at the ABC website, herbalgram.org. So with that, I'm thrilled to turn to the topic of today's webinar, again, the carbon footprint of tea. And I'll give a brief introduction, and then we'll want to leave the time for discussion, and also we'll be setting aside 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, not the chat box, so that we can find them. So Jane Frank is a Vice President of Strategic Sourcing and Sustainability at Numi Organic Tea, where she works with Numi's supply ecosystem from origin through manufacturing to build strong partnerships and identify opportunities for shared impact. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you.
And Kayalin Akens-Irby is Chief of Staff at Planet FWD, which is a leading carbon management platform for consumer brands to tackle climate change. She also serves as a board member for the Upcycled Food Association and a climate fellow for Amasia VC. Welcome, Kaya. So thank you both for joining, and I'm thrilled to be able to dive in a little bit more to this topic. And maybe Jane, could you start us off, and what is carbon labeling?
Yeah,
important about
definitely. Great. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Anne, for inviting us. And I'm going to share a couple of slides just to kind of walk through how Numi is approaching this. So let's see. Is that in full screen, like slideshow mode that you can see?
No, not slideshow mode. Now it is.
Now it is. Okay, great. All right. Oops. Oh, okay. So I think probably most people are familiar with Numi. We're a organic fair trade tea brand based in Oakland. We've been around 23 years, and like many brands here, we're a mission-driven brand. So these pillars will probably seem very familiar to you. We've really built our company since day one around promoting healthy living, regenerating the planet, and creating opportunities for all people to thrive. And so this climate work really nests within all of those. And when we first started thinking about this, I'm going to share a couple slides that gave us the context that we needed to know that it was time to act. And this is data from, I think this data is from 2010. There's not a whole lot of data on projected climate impacts in teas and botanicals, and that's one of the limitations that can make it challenging for us to make make good decisions about, business risks in the future and what action we might want to take right now. But there is a great study put out by the Tea Institute of India, looking at Assam in particular. And if you look up on the upper right corner in Tinsukia, that is, that's where the majority of our black tea comes from. So all the black tea for our aged Earl Grey, for our golden chai, our breakfast blend, this is one of our primary partners that we've worked with for years. And, we have a water project there and we visit them regularly. And, this is where our tea comes from. And we can see right now, under current climate conditions, this has been a great place to grow tea. Now, if we look forward to, this is what's called a representative, I'm going to get this wrong, RCP, which is basically like a 2-degree warming world. So this is the projection for tea suitability in Assam under a 2-degree world. And we can see already that, not only has most of the region been wiped out, Tinsukia, where we source from, is moved from very good to marginal. And then if we go to a 2 to 3 degree world, it's pretty much non-existent. There won't be tea in Tinsukia, by 2050, if not before. So, for us, this is sobering information, and I think it hits home on so many levels as a human being. Obviously, as somebody working in this industry, there's a lot to just kind of pause and absorb in that. But I think it also provides motivation to say that this is the time for us all to understand what our impacts are and how it's landing, how it will be landing in our supply chains and what we can do about it. So, what we've done is invested in climate or in measurement data, emissions data, and we did that starting in 2018 or so. And now we go through an annual mapping process. So an annual emissions accounting process. So this is our 2021 carbon dioxide equivalent data. You can see the scope 1, 2, and 3 is kind of the standard breakouts for the GHG protocol. Scope 1 and 2 are your owned operations. So we use third-party manufacturing. We don't own our own facilities. So our scopes 1 and 2 are minimal. And I think like most consumer goods companies, all of the meat is in our scope 3. So that's all of our purchased goods and services. And scope 3 is further broken down, as you can see here, into subcategories. And so we review that every single year. We analyze it. We look at where there's been changes and why those changes have happened. And then every year we come up with a reduction plan to reduce where we can and then offset the rest. And that's kind of where we've been. I just want to, because I think it would be of interest to this group, I'll dive a little bit too into our botanical ingredients. So this is actual GHG results by ingredient. And I think, some pretty interesting things here we can see with the teas, the black tea, the green tea, our sencha green tea, all of the teas have a much heavier processing component. So all of that post-harvest, drying, withering, sorting, grading, all of that is really showing up here. Whereas you have something like cinnamon and there's very little processing. And all of the emissions really are in that co-packing, warehousing, shipping. So I think this is an important one for the botanical industry and for the tea industry to really wrap our arms around is what's important to focus on is going to vary significantly by ingredient type. And for us, for the most part, it's not going to be changes in farming practices necessarily, especially, if your foundation is organics, right? So that, I think it changes some of the strategy and approach and levers that we have to pull as an industry. And then so what we've done, as I said, since we really started in probably 2016 on this journey, and then in 2019 was the first year that we measured and offset everything. And then as we've gotten more comfortable with our data, late last fall, we decided to put the data on the package. And we had been talking about this for a number of years. And one of the variables that we had discussed was whether or not to put the boiling of the water on that there. And I'm really glad that we decided to do that. And when we made the decision to put our carbon data on the pack with this carbon label that we'll be rolling out to consumers starting this summer, we then reached out to Planet Forward. We wanted to audit our data to ensure that it was robust before we went out there and put it in the marketplace and put it in front of consumers. So we went through a really thorough auditing process with Planet Forward, and then we also worked with them to develop the data point around the boiling of the water and that calculation. So yeah, really interesting. And then I'm going to kick it over to Kayalin to talk a little bit more about carbon labels, and we can get into all of this more later. So there we go.
So yeah, Kayalin, it'd be great if you could follow up and talk about what Planet Forward brings to this discussion about the labeling. And
absolutely. Yeah, well, I'll start just by introducing Planet Forward and then getting into a little bit of, what are carbon labels? What do they look like? Where are they happening? Why are they happening? And how prevalent is it? Which I think is a really interesting question for a lot of people, because, this is kind of a novel idea that's come into play and becoming more mainstream really as of the last year. It's people like Jane pushing forward, the conversation in places like Numi and kind of pioneers that are starting this, but it's really picking up steam. So we'll walk through a lot of that. But my name is Kayalin. I'm our chief of staff at Planet Forward. Planet Forward is the leading carbon management platform for consumer products. So we're extremely focused on doing all of the carbon accounting and unlocking the power of climate action for companies like Numi in the food and beverage space. We have the largest life cycle assessment database for North America for agricultural production systems. So I already saw some questions in the chat around, would love to hear a little bit about your approach for how you collected this data. We can get into the nitty-gritty of how all the calculations work and how you as an operator can pursue carbon labeling for your company. But one of the key pieces is the data, right? Knowing how the water that contributed to growing X particular crop, or knowing about the energy type that went into this particular processing step. So where Planet Forward is valuable and how Planet Forward comes into this equation is that we have just really, really robust data on all of those pieces for any company that's interested in understanding the carbon footprint of either their company or of their products. And I think another piece that's really important to call out is just that for any, botanicals company, for a tea company, 80 to 90%, as Jane mentioned, of your footprint is largely going to be in your scope 3 and in your supply chain, and potentially in places that it's really hard to understand what exactly that information is. If you don't have one-to-one relationships with every single supplier, it might be difficult to understand your exact footprint of every ingredient and every packaging material. So Planet Forward can come in and backfill all of that with our robust data sets and models. And that's what we're focused on doing to really unlock insights for people. But me personally, I am just extremely bullish on the concept of carbon labeling, and I'll share my screen as well to kind of put some of this into perspective. But I think that there are so many reasons why brands should pursue it. And there is the obvious kind of more environmentally focused ideas around, let's see, can you guys see my screen here? Perfect. So I think when you think about any decision making around climate, there's obviously all the environmental reasons, the things that feel right for us and good for us, which is really about fighting climate change. But there's also a ton of business upside for doing this work today as well. And so I want to talk about both sides of that coin. So when we think about, in general, the why is, we should be tackling climate change. We're just dramatically behind on all of our climate goals today globally. You can see here that there's a 90% footprint reduction that we need to achieve globally as people and as businesses, and we're really only at 5% against that goal today versus where we need to be by 2050. So there needs to be just a dramatic speed up of that. And I think this idea of carbon literacy is a huge piece of that equation. People cannot think, about how to make more sustainable decisions if they don't have any reference point as to what is more sustainable. So when we think about empowering consumers to be part part of the solution in general, carbon labeling is an opportunity to do that. And overall, consumers are looking for brands to step up and do that. We'll see everything that comes of Numi's decision to do it, but Planet FWD has been working with a number of brands that had done carbon labeling. We've been collecting firsthand data in the market about how people are responding to these things. And just by and large, consumers are out there asking for brands to be more sustainable. They're asking for them to take the lead on climate. They're asking them to demonstrate what it actually means to be sustainable, not a greenwashing claim, not some kind of sweeping, we are X. It's like, show me the data. That's where carbon labeling comes into play. So today, when we think about CPG and tea and botanicals role within that, over the last 5 years, 55% of the growth of the overall market has come from sustainably marketed products, while they only made up 16% of the overall category, which I think is a pretty mind-blowing stat if you think about kind of where this is all going and what people are looking for and what is being rewarded in the market. And so carbon labeling comes in as one of those opportunities to stand out and to set your brand ahead as somebody who's leading on climate. Absolutely. And there's a number of businesses that are doing it today. So on this slide, you can see some of those, from Just Salad to Numi to Oatly to Corn to Cocoa Kind. Unilever recently committed to carbon labeling their full product portfolio globally. We have things called eco labels being piloted by Nestle and the European government in the EU to actually regulate this, to have it be a requirement to put the carbon footprint of products on package. So there's a large uptick in terms of companies carbon labeling voluntarily, but there's also absolutely precedent furthest along in Europe today for this being a requirement for brands in the near term. And largely that's being modeled against what we've seen in the nutrition labeling space, as that being kind of the comparison of how this might take place and be regulated and take hold in a way that's comparable and standardized. And then quickly, I just wanted to call out one case study of we've worked with Numi, which Jane's been doing an incredible job of, telling the story of, but another company that we've been working with recently on carbon labeling is Just Salad. And they put the carbon labels of every single one of their meals in their stores, and also provide the opportunity for customers to engage with them on their app and all of these different places, which is, I think, a really awesome demonstration of how carbon labeling can become a part of a customer's just relationship with you as a brand, where it starts to feel really native and part of the reason that they interact with you overall. And another thing reason I want to call out Just Salad is because we actually do have information from them around what the benefits of doing carbon labeling have been for sales and for the company. So we worked with them to calculate the carbon footprint of every single one of their meals, carbon label those meals, and then we even call out the lowest footprint meals in stores as climatarian options. And when the climatarian menus launched, there was an 126% sales increase week over week for that particular set of meals, which is just really exciting, because one of the things people always ask is, okay, sure, of course I want to do this, but like, what's the ROI of it? What's the business impact of it? How do I sell this to my CMO? How do I sell this to my CEO? And we're starting to get the data that people are really responding to it in a positive way, which is super, super exciting.
That's great. Thank you. I wanted to follow up with that, Jane, if you could dig in a little bit to what you found in your data, like how, especially for sourcing botanicals, which are small amounts from different regions of the world that you, as I think you said, can have little control over, you don't understand the complexities and aren't there.
Yeah. I think one of the most surprising things, I mean, Camellia sinensis is the majority of our business. And I think one of the most surprising things there was to see like the sequestration that was happening at the farm level already, which when the data came back, it was like, oh, of course, it made sense, right? It's basically an agroforestry system, built on organic principles. So, that was exciting to see that show up. And then to see that the processing equipment was the primary source of emissions in our supply chain. So that also makes sense, if you think about like some of these remote areas, they're using, pretty old school equipment. They might be using diesel generators. They might be running like charcoal kilns. All of that is happening, and that was where the primary emissions were. So that was super interesting and also challenging, right? That's a hard thing to create change around. So I think those were the two kind of biggest discoveries. And one of the things that was particularly challenging about that was because I think we had aspirations of insetting, and we spent a good year, I think all of 2018, I spent the whole year working on like insetting potential within a few of our key farming partners, like, going there, doing like deep dive surveys. And the conclusion that we came to was that like there just wasn't enough additionality within the landscape to justify like the ROI on on some of the practices that we were thinking of putting in place. So there wasn't enough additionality available to justify an insetting project within that would put any kind of dent in our overall carbon footprint. So yeah, there's been a lot of learnings along the way and kind of assumptions that have been debunked.
I wanted to stay with you and follow up a little bit, because this is also a question they wanted to know, like, how actually did you gather the data around the farming and the tea, and for crops that weren't tea, weren't in an agroforestry, I don't know, chamomile or things like that.
So what we did, we used the 80-20 rule, which is pretty standard. The first thing we did was map our whole supply chain. So, we've got 130 different ingredients coming in from like 30-ish countries, on any given year. And of course, for 60% of that purchase volume, we know exactly where it's coming from. We know the farmers, we know their kids, like we've been there, we're intimate. But there was a whole nother chunk that we didn't know. And, probably that majority, that was 7 or 8 different origins and, producer groups. So it was really getting the data on the rest of them. And that required, and sometimes that was going through our first tier suppliers to get visibility into second tier suppliers. And in some cases, third tier suppliers, right? And so that really required a lot of trust. And just a high trust relationship with our first tier suppliers that that disclosure, that they could confidently disclose that information to us. And it was interesting. We definitely got a lot of insights from that. There were some ingredients we didn't realize were as important to us as they were, because we spent so much time focusing on the Camellia sinensis. So, that kind of put into like basically our top 11 ingredients that make up 83% of our purchase volume. We got really clear on those. And then from there, we worked with Soil and More, which is an organization in the Netherlands. We chose them because they have a lot of experience working in teas and botanicals. And Tobias, who I think maybe has worked with probably some folks on this call as well, he worked with us on our assessment. And so we did a farm level, he developed like a custom farm level survey tool that then we deployed to the farms. And in some cases, like for China, we had it translated into Chinese. We have an organic auditor who we work with pretty closely there. And so we actually had him, taking the data, or overlapping it with his farm visits that he had scheduled anyways. So kind of leveraging that to get the data back. In some cases we were going there, so we did it ourselves, right? So we kind of got all that primary data back for those 11 ingredients. And then Soil and More, they actually ran the model on it. And then, added in the pieces. We'd been doing our transportation anyways with carbon funds since 2011. So we've been mapping that and calculating that. So we've kind of put together all these different pieces. And then over the years, we've kind of added different custom, it gets a little complicated here, but we've added different like custom LCA data like through the years too, to try to have as much primary data as possible in our model. And then where we don't have primary data, we use, as Kayalin was mentioning, like we'll use databases, where we don't have that like granular primary data.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I feel like it would probably, one of the takeaways I want everyone to get from this call is that this work is totally doable and accessible and tangible. And sometimes it can feel really daunting and overwhelming. And so I wanted to start maybe just by even laying out like what the individual steps are of how you'd get from kind of point A to having a carbon label. And then what goes into that and what your options are. Because I'd say Numi's approach with getting primary data is the aspiration, but there are starting points for everyone. So in general, I mean, in terms of creating a carbon footprint for an individual product, you need to go through a carbon accounting process, which there's company level accounting, but really what you need for a carbon label is a life cycle assessment. So a product LCA, which I think is just important to start. And there's leading global standards for how exactly you should go about that accounting. So the PAS 2050 and the GHG protocols product standard and ISO 14044 series are kind of the global standards for carbon accounting at the product level, which is important because a question that we get all the time is, how do you know you took everything into account that was supposed to be? How do you know that this is accurate? How do you know that this is actually comparable to other people out there? And so standards alignment, I think, is a really important piece of the whole carbon labeling conversation, because if everyone's kind of willy-nilly, calculating things in different ways, we're not really achieving what we're trying to and being able to put forth, an accurate number that says something about the management practices and the truth behind your product. So that's really important. So there is very much a framework and a playbook as to what should be incorporated into your carbon footprint as laid out by those standards. And then when it comes to what makes up that, for a tea company, for example, it's your ingredients, it's your packaging materials, it's your processing steps, it's your transportation, it's the consumer use phase, like the boiling water, and then it's the end of life. And so getting the individual information for your product for each of those pieces, you can do a number of ways. You can take the Jane Frank killer, I know everything about LCA's approach and do it yourself, which is honestly a heroic effort. And it takes a lot of expertise. And that's kind of been the status quo today, is that people need, like PhDs and LCAs to do this work, or they're engaging with consultants that might be extremely expensive and take a very long time. And you have a stagnant, output, and then you walk away and have to do it again if anything changes. And then there's kind of the emergence of climate tech, which is new to the scene, but in a really important piece of the conversation. My favorite quote just around climate tech in general is that the technology industry's contribution to fighting climate change is not going to be some rocket science or some carbon capture technology. It's really just applying methodologies and mentalities around scalability to these issues. And so when you think about Planet FWD, for example, and our contribution to this space, is to simplify all of those pieces and to make this work extremely accessible, lower cost, and faster for the companies that want to do it, so that everybody can. And that's really the only way that carbon labeling would get to scale in the way that we want it to, where you can walk into a grocery store and see every product with a carbon label on shelf, is that if you don't need a PhD to do it, and you don't need, perfect information, and you don't need, years of preparation. And so, and I think that it's also a continuous improvement process. So if you wanted to come in and say, work with a Planet FWD on carbon labeling, you could come in today without perfect information on your supply chain, tell us what ingredients you're sourcing, what regions they came from, or what supplier you're working with, if you know that. And then we'd go out with our LCA experts and go research that ingredient for you if we didn't already have something that was highly accurate and representative in our database. And so it's kind of a constant process of being able to add more for the benefit of everyone. So if we've gone out and we've already researched, how one particular tea is grown in one particular region, and we have all that data, the next person that comes in now has that, and it starts to build on itself, which is just a really positive for the whole ecosystem. And then you have, as Jane said, a hotspot analysis of all of the, highest drivers across all of your ingredients. And so maybe next year we focus on the top 10% of your largest drivers, and we go out and we talk to those suppliers and specifically, and we get primary data from them. And we're kind of approaching it in a strategic way so that you're not burning out your team, and you can really get to a point of having an outcome sooner. So the companies that work with us on carbon labeling, we can really get through an end-to-end process within a matter of weeks to months, depending on how many products you have. But it's a really, really fast turnaround to the extent that teams are kind of willing to work with us on just giving us the details of their information. And that comes down to everything down to like what the farming practices that are used on farm. We can actually model in like regenerative practices without having to go out and take a soil sample on the farm. That's kind of like the power of the data, if that is helpful to put it into context. So I think that this space is picking up steam, but we're also just constantly adding more efficiency into the process so that more and more companies can get on board, and then it seems more and more accessible.
Great. Jane, do you want to add from your perspective?
I would just say, yeah, I mean, I think it's easy. Like, you know, when we started this, like 6 years ago, yeah, there was not a Planet Forward, you know, and you really had to go out there and kind of monkey wrench it all together yourself. So I think, you know, as Kayalin is stating, like now more than ever, like the tools are emerging and developing to make this possible for industry, you know, to approach, I think.
To follow up, Kayalin, on your point, so is that how you all do the auditing? Or so Numi has this data, and then the auditing for the label, what's that involve?
Yeah, so we worked with Numi in kind of a non-standard way for Planet Forward, but Jane and I, we had like a real great conversation one day. She's like, you know, we need to get these labels out. I'm like, all right, we're going to find a way to make it happen as quickly as possible. And she had already done so much of the legwork. So we took the approach of auditing the work that she had done so that she had, you know, a third-party certification to say these labels are accurate and they've been done in alignment with the standards that I had called out earlier. So our team, which has, you know, LCA experts and climate scientists, reviewed the work that had been done. And there was a few tweaks that we made, like, for example, thinking about including the boiling of the water, or a few corrections that we found around like transitional crops and things that came up within the process that I think were good learning experiences for both of us. So that was a non-standard way than how Planet Forward typically works with companies, which is where we come in kind of from the ground and we do the carbon footprinting, where companies come in, they input their data to the Planet Forward platform. So you'd go in, we have a full product LCA tool where you go in and you input your ingredients, you tell us about the farming practices that went into growing that ingredient, where it was sourced from, you tell us what your packaging materials are and the weight of your packaging materials, you tell us what processing steps your product goes through, and then you tell us any information you have about your distribution. And so we really make it like a templatized, very simple thing where you're just inputting your basic product information. And then on the back end, we're doing all of those, you know, calculations on, okay, interesting, their manufacturing facility is here, their distribution facility is here, we're calculating the route, we're calculating the fuel usage, all of the things that ideally you don't want to have to deal with. Outside of just telling us how you made your product. So that's the way that we typically go about working with companies, is just running the calculations ourselves from the ground up using product information inputted by brands.
Yeah, I would like just piggyback a little bit on that. Like for those of you, you know, we're all in, I think probably most of us are in consumer brands. So, you know, like I'd been wanting to put this on the product for quite some time. And then last summer, you know, was kind of getting positive alignment with the marketing team and executive leadership. And so we had this like opportunity to kind of get it through, but of course it was slotting it into a packaging change that was happening. And so it was really like, okay, you know, okay, Jane, we can do this, but you got to get us the data, you know, within like 4 weeks, because that's how long we have to finalize this packaging, to get it uploaded, you know, and get it through like print proof and all of that, you know, to even like get it in queue for the following year. So, you know, and that's where I think Planet Forward really shines, is understanding those timelines within food companies, and, you know, and being able to deliver against them. Because that would be unheard of, I think, with just about any other LCA company out there.
There's a question that kind of follows on the labeling. It's Leah Greiner asked why you chose to display your carbon label based on an average across blends rather than by blend. Yeah. And just in general, how you decided was that a complex thing to decide what to include on the label? And
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And I want to clarify that label I'm showing you there is our like kind of generic label, because so as I mentioned, we've got those top 11 ingredients. So where we had, like for our aged Earl Grey, for example, the label is specific to aged Earl Grey. And for our rooibos or rooibos chai, those are specific to those blends. But there are other blends that we didn't have where they fell outside of that 80-20, you know, they were in the 20%. So there we did use an average, you know, an average value. So good question. And then what we chose to include, well, part of it was like marketing saying like, we can't have every subcategory in here. We need to make it like, you know, approachable and understandable for the consumers. So we got to pick some buckets. So really it was about, you know, what are the key buckets that we want to include that are going to make be the most readable and relevant for anyone picking up that box of tea, and will give them the best kind of information reflecting where those emissions actually are. So that's kind of how we came up with those buckets. You know, I of course would love to get granular, but if, you know, there's no room on the package and most people aren't, you know, don't want to go there. So so that's kind of how we arrived at that. And the boiling of the water was a big discussion. As I said, you know, it was really like, you know, what will consumers know what to do with that? And does it matter? You know, I think that was the biggest decision point around it was, do we add the boiling of the water or not? And really, and that's where the partnership with Planet FWD was so important, because they were able to we took our distribution data. And, you know, of course, we don't know how every household is boiling their water. But we basically used our distribution data across the US, and then Planet FWD took that and looked at average grid mix within that region, you know, what the emissions factors were for that particular grid zone, as well as the likelihood or like the prevalence of electric versus gas appliances in households, and came up with a weighted average for each of those regions that was then kind of averaged across all of the regions essentially. So and that's really where we needed the expertise at Planet FWD to come in and figure that out for us. And it's an awesome piece of data to have. And one of the reasons that I love it is that it gives us an opportunity. You know, we've gotten a lot more involved in climate policy and climate advocacy over the last couple of years. And that piece of information in particular, I think opens up a whole new line of conversation with our consumers around climate, around energy policy and why energy policy matters. You know, and why, you know, I think it can sound like, you know, nobody in Washington can agree to anything, like, you know, what does that even mean to clean up our electric grid, you know, but then when you see it there and you understand how that relates to the choices we're making or maybe not making, we're kind of compelled into, you know, because of the infrastructure in our communities, then it becomes really clear, you know, why we need transformation on our electric grid, and why we need, you know, at the both local level and the state level and the federal level, you know, we need action, and we need our politicians to step up, and we all have something to say about it. So.
It's a great point. I want to stay, Jane, with you for a second and go into processing a little bit, because so processing in botanicals is, as you said, a surprisingly big, well, maybe not surprisingly, but a big contribution, and one over which you don't have a lot of control. And so I'm curious how you're thinking about that, what to do with that data now.
Yeah, so we're kind of due for a refresh on the data, and I'm curious to see what it looks like, because this process has instigated conversations with some of our key tea suppliers and accelerated like their planning and their transition away. Like, for example, the green tea in China, it has accelerated their transition to, I think someone was posting something about low energy dryers, to that upgraded equipment, moving away from charcoal kilns to electric kilns, fuel switching in some cases to, you know, like high efficiency wood pellets, which again, not perfect, but a step in the right direction. So we've seen that, you know, even just sharing this data back with our supply chain in places where they have the technical capacity and financial resources to do so, they have, you know, chosen to, I don't know that it's because of this, but it has like encouraged, decision making to accelerate transition, which is really exciting. I think there are other places it's going to be more challenging. Like, we did spend some time thinking about like, what would it cost to like, if we just, took our rooibos production and transitioned all of that to, solar, right? I mean, well, first of all, in South Africa, you're not allowed to plug any renewables into the grid. It's just, you can't do it, right? So then you've got to have an array that has enough storage capacity to run flawlessly 24/7, and be a complete island, right? And that's about $250,000. So that's like off the table for us. So that's, those are the types of challenges that I don't have a clean answer for right now. And I think do require kind of policy intervention, and that's policy intervention outside of the United States, which makes it even more challenging, right? So, I don't have a good answer for that. But at least knowing like the dimensions of the issue creates an opportunity for people to think about it differently, and for us to start to imagine something else, I think.
Kayalin, do you want to add anything to that part of the, the processing manufacturing piece of things?
Yeah, I think, even if it's not even if you don't have the ability to act on it immediately, it's extremely helpful to know, right? And you can start to think about that as you scale and as you think about, where your next facility will be built or how. And we've had a number of customers use the information around, their current emissions intensity of their processing, or, the current breakdown of what's contributing to that, be a driver in their thinking in terms of where they choose to build additional locations as they grow. And so I think, there's pressure to do everything like in year one, but that's not necessarily what's feasible. And without the information to know how those decisions will impact your footprint going forward, you're not going to be factoring that in. So I think that the more and more we're just operationalizing this in the way that we make business decisions, period, is a win, and not beating ourselves up, 1000% if it's not this year's change.
Erin Douglas asked, sort of following this, she wondered if there are other, what you all both think the best free low-cost tools for Scope 3 measurements are. And she specifically wondered if you had experience with the free B estimator from climateneutral.org.
We use that. So we're a climate neutral certified brand, so we do use it. I think it's most, any of these like models are going to be most useful when you can come to them with as much like granular data on your operations as possible. So there are tons of models out there where you can that are basically like cost, based on cost, right? Like cost emissions estimators. And you can you could just take all your accounts payables and like plug them in there and get something back. And that's, I think, like the most, like if you really don't have anything, like you're just flying blind like that, and that's kind of using model, just publicly available model data. And then if you can go a step further and, like take transportation, for example, and look at like, you can figure out, your average, kind of road miles and what kind of engine it was and what was the weight on that truck, right? You've suddenly like transformed the quality of your data into something that's going to be a much better decision-making tool, for you. And so, for example, like what Planet FWD can do is they can look at your specific ingredients. And this was something that wasn't available when we did this in 2016. But they could take our ingredients and say, okay, well, we don't have data on organic yerba mate from Brazil. So let's go out and take our expertise and we'll kind of build our own model around that ingredient that's going to be appropriate for you. Because there is so much differentiation within the botanicals industry, it's really difficult. So even like the bee, which we do use, I don't use that for our ingredients because they don't really have, we have a chocolate product. So I use like the cocoa bean one, but that they just don't have like you can't go in there and find like chamomile, so, that's where, and because that's the heart of our business, I feel that it's very important to have that be as specific as possible, and it's therefore worth the investment to get that foundation in those ingredients, whether it's with a partner like Planet Forward, or there's tons of folks out there, but I think Planet Forward is awesome because they're priced correctly for brands like ours, and because they do it within a reasonable time frame that it makes sense for decision makers. So that's what I would recommend. I also we joined the SME Climate Hub, and I've been kind of paying a little bit of attention to, they have gone big in Europe and the UK first, and now they're kind of starting to come over to the US. And their whole goal is to create tools, like a suite of tools for small and medium enterprises. They do have a estimator that's available to SME Climate Hub members, and it's totally free to sign up. I took a look at it, like their estimation for our operation, which was basically just like industry type, size, location. It was way off. Like it was, I think, a quarter of what our actual emissions are. So, that's where yes, there's lots of free tools out there, but you really want to understand what they're doing, what their kind of foundation is, and kind of really make sure that you understand what they're offering and how it relates to what's core to your business. So proceed with caution, I think, is my my closing remarks on that.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think it's really important to think about your goals and your outcomes in terms of what you want the information for. If you want it for reporting, for one thing, it needs to be accurate. So many of the tools might not, meet that very basic requirement, as Jane called out. But I think ideally a lot of us should be, looking into our footprints for the purpose of reduction. That should really be everyone's goal. And I think what Jane called out was the difference between economic data versus life cycle assessment data, which is a really important distinction to be able to make in terms of what's available to you for accounting purposes. And so many of these free tools, if not all, are, and again, I'm not trying to bash that, because it could be a really great starting place, even just to orient yourself around how these processes work and what types of information it includes. But if you're taking an economic data-based approach, the only levers that are impacting your footprint are a generic emissions factor, which might be as generic as a country average. And so if you think about, your specific chamomile versus even a country level average chamomile, if they have it at all, it's not going to be reflective of your farming practices or any investments you've made in improving sustainability within, your supply chain and operations. Like that, you're not getting accounting that's representative of the choices that you've made, for better or for worse. And then that's attached to a spend factor. So when you think about once you get the number back, your only ability to reduce that would be to change your spend, right? And that's not, we can't just stop making products. That's not really, the goal here. And so life cycle assessment data is broken out across all of the individual pieces that make up a, pound of chamomile. It's the growing practices, it's the processing steps, it's the transportation from farm to processor, it's any packaging that went into the transportation. It's all of the individual pieces that made up that chamomile. And so when you start to think about reduction, you can determine, as Jane showed you, was it my farming practices, or was it my processing steps, or was it my packaging? Is it, if I lightweighted, if I had less secondary packaging and the transportation from my chamomile from farm to processing facility, is that what would change my footprint? That's the type of information you need as an operator to actually get to the point of being able to reduce. And that's why life cycle assessment data is so important. And so I think that the capabilities they have, the accuracy, all of that can be questionable, but I also think it's really important to understand what you even have the ability to do based on the types of data that are going into these assessments.
And to follow up with two, well, one, Aaron Douglas asked the estimated cost range for single product LCA with Planet Forward. Before you speak, I'm curious. So you talked about what a company can look for to make sure the data is going to be somewhat accurate as a customer buying these products as more labels get on the product shelf. It seems like there's huge room for greenwashing. So what do we look for?
Yeah, I can start,
Yeah.
Jane. And then you want to
Go
build?
for it. Yeah.
So one of the most important things that a consumer should look for and that we should be disclosing as brands putting carbon labels out into the world is the scope. So that is one area where even if someone was standards aligned in their carbon accounting practices, they may have had a different scope of what was taken into account in their footprint. So we might have, for example, was it cradle to gate, meaning that it didn't take into account the end of life of those products? Was it just the ingredients and it didn't take into account the packaging materials? Was it a full, cradle to grave LCA of the full product? The scope is something that's really, really important, because you might have a lower footprint because you were actually only accounting for a percentage of what someone else was putting out there. So I think that's a really, really important piece. I do think that being able to have, third-party certification of these numbers is an important piece in the standardization and the enforcement of the accuracy and credibility of them going forward. We do really want to make sure that as we, pick up prevalence of carbon labeling, that it's a system that people can rely on and a system that people feel does hold weight. Because if we keep kind of disarming every single solution that we come up with by, someone did it wrong and now it's greenwashing, we're taking away our power to really be able to push things forward. Like carbon labeling in a perfectly executed system should be able to, you should be able to walk into a store and know that Numi is a great company. Like they really invest in, the sustainable farming practices of growing their tea, and they have made significant investments in having, the packaging that they've pioneered, and all of these things that they should be rewarded for in their carbon footprint. And if we don't have a system that's kind of enforcing that standardization, those types of things won't be called out and they won't be rewarded for it in the way that they should, which is how we would love the system to work in an ideal setting. So I think scope is really huge. I think third-party sign-off and review of calculations is really, really huge as well.
Before I ask Jane the same question, do you want to share on the cost?
Yeah, so for one thing, I will say that everyone is welcome to talk to me afterwards, and 100%. The way that Planet FWD operates is on a subscription basis. So we offer subscriptions for starting as up to 10 products per year and kind of ranging based on how large your product portfolio is. And our costs can range from like $2,000 per product per year to it kind of depends on exactly the range and the scope. And so, but we do operate on a subscription basis. So kind of happy to have individual conversations. That's probably the best place to go about it. But I will just say that we in general have a commitment to accessibility. We have a commitment to, making this work available for everyone. So we offer discounts for startups and things like that. And so happy to kind of talk about it offline.
Jane, did you want to add any more to the question about?
I was going to say scope also. I would probably say scope and auditing of the numbers. Yeah.
There's one question, Jane, for you from Taylor Clayton, who wondered if the low ROI that you mentioned for in-setting projects, you just had questions if you could clarify, was that more to monetary factors or? Yeah.
So what we figured, like what we were looking at was like, we had the option to improve. It was mainly around like improving manure management and compost, like actual like composting practices, cover cropping and shade trees are, that's there. So like, the only lever we really had to pull was, investing heavily like in improved manure management. And when we thought about like the cost, like we costed out with Soil and More, like what those workshops would cost, like what that investment would be for one farm to get something started. And like, very quickly, it was pretty expensive compared to a negligible reduction in, in actual emissions. So, it was like best case scenario, we maybe could have, sequestered an additional like it could have been anywhere from like 30 to 60 tons of CO2e. And even then, it's like additionality is a little bit tricky in a farm setting like that, because you're like, well, this is something that's improving their farm practices anyway. So is this considered, like, would they be doing this anyways? Like, how do you really demonstrate that this wouldn't have happened otherwise without an intervention, right? So, that's where, we decided that that money was better used in other areas, like, for example, investing in our plant-based packaging, which has reduced our packaging footprint significantly. So if we kind of we don't have an infinite amount of resources, so we had to kind of look at it and be like, okay, we have a finite amount of resources. Like, we would love to do that soil manure project with that farm for many reasons, but it's not necessarily going to get us the return in terms of like what we're trying to achieve with carbon reduction. And we're already doing really well with carbon reduction on the farms. So is there another place where we should be focusing that investment where we're going to get a bigger ROI?
It's great just to see the power of having that kind of data. And then you have information you need to make decisions.
Yeah.
We're coming to the end, and there's a few more specific questions that maybe if you all have a moment to check, Jane, there's some specific things for you. But I wanted to, and before asking you all one final question, for those of you in the call, next week with Sustainable Herbs Program members, we're going to have a brown bag discussion where Jane will come and really dig in a little bit more to the tools and how botanical companies can kind of work together or to address some of these challenges and opportunities in the botanical supply chain. So if you're not a member, you can contact me and find out how to join. But I wanted to ask in closing, Jane, I'll ask you first, what you've taken on is, to me, mind-bogglingly complex. And I wanted to personally, what has really driven you and keeps you motivated in when it gets overwhelming?
Yeah. That's a emotional question. It's my kids, seeing them every day and just thinking about the world they're going to be in. It's, like, I got these from the garden yesterday. These are I didn't think I was going to get another batch of sweet peas, and they smell so good and I love them. And, just having that joy in my home, and, that was, the surprise of finding that in my garden, and just, really honoring that, that place where I feel most deeply connected to life, and really orienting, my activities, in service to that. And that's what motivates me.
Thank you. I also wanted to, when we spoke before, and also when you were talking about that data that you got from Assam, and how this is people's lives on the other side of that data. I wondered if you wanted to.
Yeah, that's a big piece of it is, you look at that, I can't look at that map without thinking of, the people I've met in the fields, and, how this will be impacting, their lives. And what responsibility do we have? We are a mission-driven brand, but this is a new challenge for us, and one that is existential. What does that responsible business relationship look like in the context of this change? And how do we meet that? Meet that in an ethical way.
Thank you. Kayalin.
Yeah. I appreciate you, Jane, so much, and you as well, Anne. And I always feel honestly just blessed to do this work, like, so deeply. I don't actually know. I was having a conversation last night. Like, I don't really know how I would move through the world as a happy person without it, because it's so important to me to be able to show up every day and put my energy towards ideally the solution, because it does feel so dire. But I mean, I have been an impact-oriented person from my origination. My parents actually met at Earth Day, which might have made it prophetic that I ended up this way. But I grew up in California. I grew up, like, in the ocean and in the mountains and in the hills. And that to me was more of a home than anywhere. And really early on in my career, I actually started doing reef conservation work. And if we think about some of the places around the world or the environments that are most heavily, not necessarily most heavily impacted, but demonstrating actively the impacts of climate change most clearly, reefs is one of them. And so I was, super young and having just breakdowns on the daily, thinking about how incredibly terrifying it is that if this is what's happening to, some of our most incredible underwater worlds, like what comes next, and then what comes next, and then what comes next, and to the point where I have true anxiety attacks in a frequent way. I think climate anxiety is really real, and especially for kind of, younger generations in particular that are growing up in the world where that's all they hear all the time. It was different to kind of like pursue it and feel like it was a passion when I was younger. Now it's like 100% just the imperative. And so I see working on climate as an incredible privilege that this moment in time has. Like in a little bit, it would be too late. We have the only real window to still do something about this, as I showed on that slide before. Like we have the exact framework that says if you can pull this off in the next 20 years, then you might make it, right? But if you don't, then you don't. And so I just don't know what else I would do with that knowledge.
Thank you all both so much. I really appreciate like the big picture, the emotional, the motivating factor, and the concrete data and steps. So thank everyone, all of you, for joining, and thank you both, Jane and Kayalin. And we will share a copy of the recording tomorrow. And Kayalin, I think, shared her email contact. And if you need to contact Jane, I'm sure she'll share it too.
Yep.
But thank you both.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Anne. And thank you everybody for coming.
Bye.
Bye.